At 3:47 a.m. on December 18, 1944, Sergeant Vicente Teng Manalastas lay flat in a hastily dug foxhole overlooking the Pampanga River crossing, watching 73 Imperial Japanese Army soldiers advance in disciplined formation across the muddy clearing 200 meters ahead, their boots squelching in rhythm, as morning mist clung to the kapok trees like wet gauze. Stretched between the trees at ankle height, invisible in the darkness, was a network of repurposed fishing nets reinforced with barbed wire and weighted with river stones, a trap his own commanding officer had called embarrassingly primitive just 18 hours earlier. The nearest American artillery support was 14 kilometers southwest at Clark Field, too far to matter in the next 6 minutes. In exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the lead Japanese scout would step directly onto the first pressure point of the net system, triggering a cascade that would entangle an entire platoon and expose them to devastating crossfire from positions the enemy didn't know existed. This is the story of how a former commercial fisherman with no formal military training became one of the most feared guerrilla fighters in central Luzon. Not because he could shoot straighter or fight harder, but because he understood something the textbooks never taught: that the jungle doesn't care about your rank, only whether you know how to listen to it. The foxhole smelled of wet earth and gun oil. Teng's fingers moved slowly across the trigger guard of his captured Arisaka rifle, careful not to make the slightest sound. To his left, hidden in identical positions along the riverbank, were 11 other guerrillas: farmers, dock workers, a former schoolteacher, one ex-policeman. None of them had attended officer training. None of them wore proper uniforms. What they wore were mismatched civilian clothes, dyed dark with mud and charcoal, their faces streaked with ash to break up their silhouettes in the pre-dawn darkness. If you're watching this from the Philippines or anywhere else in the world, drop a comment below with your country. This story deserves to be heard everywhere, because what happened in this jungle clearing changed the way insurgent warfare was understood in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese column moved with mechanical precision. They'd been doing this for 3 years, occupying, patrolling, controlling. Their intelligence reports said the guerrillas in this sector were disorganized, poorly armed, incapable of coordinated assault. The reports were half right. The guerrillas were poorly armed. Everything else was a fatal miscalculation. Teng could see the lead scout now, a young soldier barely visible in the darkness, his rifle held at ready position. Behind him, the main body of troops moved in a staggered formation, designed to minimize casualties from ambush. It was good tactics. It would have worked against a conventional ambush. But there was nothing conventional about what was waiting for them. The nets had taken 2 full days to prepare. Not to build, Teng had built fishing nets since he was 7 years old. That part was muscle memory. The challenge was adapting them for combat, understanding exactly how men moved differently than fish, how weight distributed across a net when boots hit it instead of fins, how to create not just entanglement, but strategic immobilization. Vicente Manalastas was 34 years old when the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941. He'd spent 26 of those years on or near the water. His father owned a small fishing operation out of Malabon, and Teng had grown up learning the traditional methods: how to read currents, how to predict where fish would school, how to repair nets in the dark by touch alone when a sudden tear threatened to lose an entire catch. He was not a soldier. He'd never held a rifle until 1942, when the provisional guerrilla units began forming in the mountains and jungles of Luzon after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. Teng joined because everyone was joining, because the alternative was collaboration, or starvation, or both. The American and Filipino forces had surrendered, but surrender meant different things to different people. For some, it meant survival. For others, like Teng, it meant regrouping. The resistance force he joined was designated Hukbalahap, Hukbo ng Bayan Laban sa Hapon, the People's Anti-Japanese Army. It was a grand name for what was essentially a collection of farmers with hunting rifles and factory workers with homemade explosives. The command structure was improvised. Ranks were assigned based more on literacy and leadership capability than military experience. Teng could read and write. He was older than most of the recruits, and he had a calm demeanor that people responded to in crisis situations. That made him a sergeant. What it didn't make him was a tactician, not in the eyes of the few formally trained officers who'd escaped the surrender and joined the guerrillas. These men, former Philippine Army officers, some USAF veterans, had attended military academies, studied Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, learned fire and maneuver doctrine. When Teng proposed using fishing technique over enemy interdiction, they listened politely and dismissed it immediately. Sergeant Mananalastas, Captain Reyes had said during the planning meeting on December 16th, "We appreciate creative thinking, but this is modern warfare. The Japanese Imperial Army is one of the most disciplined fighting forces in the world. They won't be stopped by fishing nets." The other officers had nodded. It wasn't personal. It was professional assessment. Fishing nets belonged on boats, not battlefields. The very idea seemed to category confuse the nature of combat. War was about bullets, explosives, steel. Not cordage and weights. But Teng had noticed something during the previous 6 months of guerrilla operations. He'd noticed it because he was used to noticing things about movement and terrain, not from tactical training, but from decades of watching how water moved, how obstacles created patterns, how living things responded to unexpected resistance. The Japanese patrols moved through the jungle with extraordinary discipline, but that discipline created predictability. They used the same trails repeatedly. They maintained the same formations. They followed doctrine even when doctrine wasn't optimal for the specific terrain. And most importantly, they were trained to respond to gunfire, explosives, and blade weapons. They had drills for ambushes. They had protocols for suppressing fire. They had tactical responses for every conventional threat. They had no protocol for what Teng was planning. To understand why Teng's technique worked, you have to understand what the Japanese Army was in 1944, not as a propaganda caricature, but as a military organization with specific strengths and critical vulnerabilities. The Imperial Japanese Army had conquered much of East and Southeast Asia through a combination of superior preparation, aggressive tactics, and doctrinal rigidity. Their infantry training was intensive. Soldiers were drilled endlessly in marksmanship, bayonet combat, and unit cohesion. The concept of Gyokusai, fighting to the death rather than surrendering, was embedded in their tactical doctrine. This made them formidable opponents in direct engagement, but it also made them predictable. Japanese tactics in 1944 followed patterns established in the 1930s during the war in China. Officers were trained to value aggression and morale over adaptability. When faced with ambushes, the standard response was immediate frontal assault to overwhelm the attackers. When taking fire, the doctrine was to charge the position rather than take cover and suppress. This had worked against Chinese forces that often lacked the weapons or training to sustain defensive fire. It had worked in the early Philippines campaign, when American and Filipino forces were disorganized and undersupplied. It was proving less effective against guerrillas who understood that survival mattered more than holding ground, and who'd learned to set traps that turned Japanese aggression into a liability. In central Luzon, the Japanese maintained control through a network of garrison towns connected by patrol routes. These patrols served multiple purposes. They projected power, they gathered intelligence, they interdicted guerrilla supply lines, and they intimidated the civilian population. The patrols were large enough to be militarily significant, typically 50 to 80 men, but small enough to be mobile. The patrol that Teng was watching on the morning of December 18th was designated the 74th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Provisional Security Detachment, according to intelligence gathered by guerrilla observers in the nearby town of Arayat. This unit had been responsible for at least 14 summary executions of suspected resistance sympathizers in the past month. They were efficient, brutal, and confident. That confidence was about to become a critical vulnerability. The guerrilla intelligence network had tracked this patrol for 3 weeks. They knew the routes. They knew the timing, departing the garrison at 2:30 a.m., reaching the river crossing by 4:00 a.m., arriving at the next checkpoint by 6:00 a.m. They knew the formation: scouts forward, main body in column, rear guard trailing by 50 meters. They knew the standard operating procedure when fired upon: immediate assault toward the source of fire, with supporting elements providing covering fire from the flanks. What they didn't know, what Captain Reyes and the other officers couldn't agree on, was how to exploit that knowledge with the limited resources available. The guerrillas had perhaps 60 functional rifles among 200 fighters. Ammunition was scarce enough that every bullet had to count. They had no artillery, no air support, no armor. They had homemade explosives that were as dangerous to the user as to the target. They had knives, bolos, and determination. And they had Teng's nets. The debate about the nets had begun 5 days earlier, on December 13th, during a logistics meeting at the guerrilla camp hidden in the foothills west of the Pampanga River. Teng had made his proposal simply: I can stop them from advancing, not with bullets, with nets. If we can immobilize the main body of their column for even 30 seconds, we can inflict casualties they can't sustain and force them to abandon the route. Captain Reyes had frowned. Explain. Fishing nets, Teng said, work by creating unexpected resistance in a medium where the target expects free movement. Fish don't see the net until they're in it because it's dimensionally thin and visually disrupted by the water. Once they're in it, instinct makes them thrash, which tightens the entanglement. Men will do the same thing, especially soldiers trained to charge forward under fire. Soldiers aren't fish, Lieutenant Santos had said. Not unkindly, but dismissively. No, Teng agreed. They're heavier, which means more momentum. They're carrying equipment, which creates more points of contact with the netting. And they're trained to move as a unit, which means if the lead element gets entangled, the following elements will collide with them rather than dispersing. It's actually better than fish. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was the silence of professional soldiers trying to process a suggestion that fell outside their conceptual framework for combat operations. Nets can be cut, Captain Reyes said finally. Not quickly. Not in the dark, under fire, while you're falling and being dragged by the weight of the men behind you. They'll shoot through them. Bullets pass through rope, but bullets won't unentangle you. They'll burn them in pre-dawn darkness while taking fire from concealed positions. Sir, respectfully, by the time they organize a response to the nets, we'll have already inflicted enough casualties to break their patrol schedule for a week. Captain Reyes had leaned back, studying Teng with the expression of a man trying to decide if he was looking at genius or delusion. You've tested this? On goats, Teng said. 3 days ago. Stretched a net across a trail, spooked a herd through it. It worked exactly as I predicted. The lead goats got tangled, the following goats piled into them, and within 5 seconds the entire herd was immobilized. Someone in the back of the meeting had laughed. Not cruelly, but reflexively. The absurdist image of guerrilla warfare being planned around goat experiments was too incongruous not to trigger a response. Captain Reyes hadn't laughed. Goats aren't soldiers. No, sir. But panic is panic. And soldiers in the dark, under unexpected physical attack, with their command structure disrupted, they'll react like anything else that suddenly can't move the way it expects to. The debate had continued for another hour. Eventually, Captain Reyes had made the decision that good commanders make when they're uncertain. He authorized a small-scale test without committing the full force to the concept. You have 2 days, Reyes had said. Set up your nets on the approach to the river crossing. If the patrol follows their pattern, you'll have your chance. I'll position 11 men with you. No more. If it works, we'll exploit the chaos. If it doesn't work, you pull back immediately, and we'll proceed with conventional harassment operations. It was a compromise. It was also a vote of minimal confidence. 11 men was barely enough to capitalize on success, let alone sustain a fight if the trap failed. Teng had accepted without argument. 11 men were enough. They had to be, because they were all he was going to get. Building a combat net system was not the same as building a fishing net, though the principles were related. Teng spent December 14th and 15th adapting his knowledge to the specific requirements of immobilizing armed infantry. The first challenge was materials. Traditional fishing nets used hemp or cotton cordage, lightweight and flexible. Those materials would work for initial entanglement, but Teng needed something that would hold against the weight and strength of thrashing soldiers. He needed redundancy. The solution came from scavenging. Abandoned fishing villages along the coast had left behind commercial-grade nets designed for deep-sea trawling. These nets used heavier cordage, reinforced edges, and multiple layers. Teng's team retrieved 4 of these nets, each approximately 30 meters long and 4 meters wide. The second challenge was weaponization. A fishing net created entanglement. Teng needed something that created pain and injury, something that would make soldiers instinctively recoil and pull back rather than push forward, thereby tightening the trap. Barbed wire was available in limited quantities, scavenged from abandoned military positions. Teng wove sections of barbed wire into the net structure, focusing on the lower sections where boots and legs would make first contact. The barbs wouldn't penetrate deeply through military boots and trousers, but they would catch and hold. More importantly, they would create the psychological sensation of being caught by something hostile something that hurt. The third challenge was deployment. The nets had to be invisible in darkness, positioned at the exact height to catch advancing soldiers at ankle to knee level, low enough to trip, high enough to entangle as they fell. They had to be anchored firmly enough to resist the initial impact of 70-plus men hitting them in sequence, but flexible enough to wrap and tighten rather than break. Tang spent hours calculating the physics. Too tight, and the net would function like a tripwire. Men would stumble, but recover. Too loose, and men would step over it or push it aside. The sweet spot was a slight slack, positioned 18 to 24 inches above ground level, supported by anchor points every 6 meters. The anchor points were trees. The jungle terrain along the river approach had dense kapok and acacia growth, perfect for creating an invisible lattice. Tang's team worked at night, stretching the nets between trees in a zigzag pattern that covered a front of approximately 40 meters and a depth of 15 meters. Any soldier advancing through that zone would encounter at least 3 layers of netting. They weighted the bottom edge of the nets with river stones sewn into fabric pouches, giving the netting mass and inertia. When a soldier's leg hit the net, instead of bouncing off, the net would give slightly, wrap around the leg, and drag downward, pulling the soldier off balance. The final element was the kill zone design. The nets weren't the weapon. They were the immobilizer. The actual killing would be done by concentrated rifle fire from guerrillas positioned in elevated, concealed positions on both flanks of the net zone. Tang had positioned his 11 men in trees and behind natural cover, creating overlapping fields of fire that converged on the center of the net trap. It was elegant in its simplicity. It was also completely unproven against human targets. On the night of December 17th, as Tang and his team made final adjustments to the net positions, one of the guerrillas, a young man named Paulo, barely 20 years old, had voiced the question everyone was thinking. "Sarge, what if they just shoot us before they hit the nets?" "Then we die," Tang had said calmly. "But they won't. They don't know we're here. Their scouts are looking for obvious ambush positions, trenches, firing pits, defended positions. We're in trees and spider holes. By the time they realize they're under fire, they'll already be tangled. And if the nets break, then we shoot faster." It wasn't reassuring, but it was honest. And in guerrilla warfare, honesty about risk was its own form of leadership. At 3:42 a.m. on December 18th, Tang heard the first sounds of the Japanese patrol approaching. Not voices. The Japanese maintained noise discipline during movements, but the subtle sounds of many men moving through jungle terrain. The clink of equipment, the rustle of fabric against vegetation, the occasional snap of a branch. The patrol was on schedule. Tang's 11 guerrillas were invisible, positioned exactly as rehearsed. No one moved. No one spoke. They'd been in position since midnight, sitting in absolute silence, controlling their breathing, waiting. The Japanese scouts appeared first. 2 men moving in a spread formation, rifles ready, eyes scanning the trail and the tree line. They were good. They moved with the careful precision of men who knew that the jungle could hide anything. They paused every few meters, listening, watching. They walked directly past the first net without seeing it. The net was 30 centimeters in front of the lead scout's face, suspended between 2 trees. In daylight, it would have been obvious. In the pre-dawn darkness, with the irregular shadows of jungle vegetation breaking up its outline, It was invisible. The scouts advanced another 10 meters, moving past the second and third net layers. They were now 15 meters into the kill zone, completely unaware. Behind them, the main body of the patrol entered the trail. This was the critical mass, approximately 60 soldiers in a loose column formation, staggered to avoid bunching up. Their rifles were slung, their attention focused forward on the scouts. They were confident. This was a routine patrol route. They'd walked it dozens of times without incident. Tang watched them approach the first net. His heart rate was steady. His breathing was controlled. This was the same feeling he'd had countless times before, watching a school of fish approach a net spread in dark water. The tension of waiting, the knowledge that the next few seconds would determine success or failure. The lead element of the main patrol was now 5 meters from the first net. 3 meters, 1 meter, contact. The lead Japanese soldier hit the first net at exactly 3:47 a.m., his right boot catching the rope line at ankle height. The net gave slightly, not enough to snap, but enough to feel wrong. The soldier's momentum carried him forward, but his leg was suddenly restrained. He stumbled. The soldier behind him, maintaining the standard 2-meter interval, didn't see the stumble in time. He collided with the first soldier just as the first soldier's left leg hit the second layer of netting. Both men went down, falling forward into the net structure. That's when the physics of the trap activated. The net, weighted at the bottom and anchored at the sides, behaved exactly as Tang had predicted. Instead of holding rigid, it flexed and wrapped, the cordage twisting around legs, arms, rifle slings, equipment straps. The barbed wire connections caught on fabric and skin, creating dozens of small points of painful contact. The soldier's instinctive response was to pull away from the pain, which tightened the entanglement. The third, fourth, and fifth soldiers in the column hit the falling bodies of the first two. They tried to stop, tried to sidestep, but the darkness and the momentum of the column behind them made it impossible. They fell into the same net structure, adding their weight and their thrashing to the growing tangle. Within 5 seconds, 15 soldiers were down, struggling in the net. The barbed wire was tearing at their uniforms, their hands, their faces. The rope cordage was wrapped around their legs in complex knots that tightened with every movement. Some of the soldiers were trying to stand. Others were trying to crawl backwards. A few were reaching for their rifles, which were slung across their backs and now twisted into the net structure. The rest of the column, still moving forward in the darkness, began colliding with the immobilized soldiers. The trail was narrow, barely 3 meters wide at this point, and the falling, thrashing mass of bodies created an impenetrable obstacle. Men shouted in Japanese, and officers barked orders. Someone screamed as barbed wire raked it across his face. The disciplined column formation dissolved into chaos in less than 10 seconds. The rear elements of the patrol, still 40 meters back and unaware of what was happening at the front, continued advancing, pushing more soldiers into the entanglement zone. Tang waited. Not yet. Let them pile up. Let the confusion spread. Let them start thinking this is an obstacle they can overcome with coordination and effort. An officer near the center of the tangled mass stood up, shouting commands. He was trying to restore order, trying to get his men to stop thrashing and start cutting the nets systematically. It was good leadership. it might have worked. Teng raised his rifle and fired a single shot. The first shot hit the standing officer in the chest, dropping him instantly. Before the sound of the rifle crack had faded, 10 more rifles opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the kill zone. The effect was catastrophic. The Japanese soldiers, already immobilized and disoriented by the nets, were now taking fire from elevated, concealed positions they couldn't see. Muzzle flashes flickered in the darkness like fireflies. There, then gone, then there again, from a different angle. Bullets snapped through the air and punched into flesh and bone with wet, heavy sounds. Men screamed, not battle cries, screams of pain and fear. The kind of sounds human beings make when they're helpless and being killed. The Japanese soldiers tried to respond according to their training. Some attempted to unsling their rifles. Others tried to return fire in the direction of the muzzle flashes. A few tried to charge the guerrilla positions. All of them were still tangled in the nets. A soldier near the front of the entanglement managed to get his rifle free and aimed. Teng shot him before he could fire. Another soldier, screaming in rage, pulled a grenade from his belt and threw it blindly toward the trees on the left flank. The grenade exploded harmlessly in empty jungle, the sound echoing across the river. The guerrillas maintained fire discipline. Aimed shots. No wasted ammunition. Teng had drilled them on this. Every bullet had to hit a target. Every target had to be a threat. Men who were still struggling with the nets were lower priority than men who had weapons free. The rear elements of the patrol, still outside the net zone, began returning fire. But they were firing blind, unable to see the muzzle flashes clearly in the darkness, unable to determine how many guerrillas they were facing. Their bullets zipped through the trees, smacking into bark and leaves, hitting nothing. A Japanese sergeant managed to organize a small group of soldiers from the rear element into a flanking maneuver, trying to get around the kill zone and assault the guerrilla positions from the side. It was smart tactical thinking. It would have worked against a conventional ambush position. Teng had anticipated it. Paulo and 2 other guerrillas, positioned 30 meters back from the main ambush line, opened fire on the flanking group. 3 soldiers went down immediately. The others dove for cover, their flanking attack broken before it could develop. The entire engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. Already, at least 20 Japanese soldiers were dead or wounded, most of them still tangled in the nets. The survivors were pinned, unable to advance or retreat effectively, taking fire from positions they couldn't locate or suppress. This was the moment when Japanese tactical doctrine created a fatal decision loop. The training said to assault the ambush position. The training said never to retreat. But the training had no protocol for this situation. Immobilized, under fire, unable to identify targets. An officer somewhere in the rear of the column began blowing a whistle, the signal for withdrawal. But the soldiers at the front couldn't withdraw. They were still tangled. They would have to cut themselves free first. And cutting free, while under fire, was a death sentence. Some soldiers tried anyway. Teng watched through his rifle sights as a young Japanese soldier pulled a knife and began sawing frantically at the ropes around his legs. The soldier was crying, tears streaming down his face, his hands shaking. Teng didn't shoot him. The soldier wasn't a threat. He was just a terrified young man trying to survive. Another guerrilla shot him anyway. Teng didn't reprimand the shooter. This was combat, not a classroom. Mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. By the 4-minute mark, The Japanese patrol had effectively ceased to function as a military unit. The front two-thirds of the column was either casualties or immobilized. The rear third was scattered in the jungle, having broken formation to seek cover from the continuous guerrilla fire. The nets had done exactly what Teng had predicted. They'd transformed a disciplined infantry column into a helpless target. The barbed wire had prevented soldiers from simply stepping over or pushing through the nets. The multiple layers had ensured that even soldiers who avoided the first net would hit the second or third. The weight and flexibility of the netting had turned every attempt to escape into further entanglement. But Teng knew the window was closing. The Japanese garrison in our yacht would have heard the gunfire by now. Reinforcements would be mobilizing. The guerrillas had perhaps 10 more minutes before they needed to withdraw, or risk being caught by a superior force. "Cease fire," Teng shouted in Tagalog. "Prepare to withdraw." The guerrilla shooting stopped. The sudden silence was overwhelming, broken only by the moaning of wounded Japanese soldiers and the sounds of men struggling with the nets. Teng and two others climbed down from their positions and moved quickly through the kill zone, retrieving weapons and ammunition from the dead and wounded. They worked fast, professionally, without conversation. Rifles, magazines, grenades, maps, anything useful. The Japanese soldiers who were still alive watched them with expressions of hatred, fear, and humiliation. One soldier, his legs hopelessly tangled, spat at Teng as he approached. Teng ignored him, taking the soldier's rifle and ammunition pouch. Another soldier pleaded in broken English, "Please, help me, I'm hurt." Teng looked at him for a moment. The soldier had a sucking chest wound, blood bubbling from his lips with each breath. He was dying. There was nothing Teng could do for him, even if he wanted to, and Teng didn't want to. "You helped occupy my country," Teng said in Tagalog, knowing the soldier wouldn't understand the words. "Die here." They finished scavenging in less than 3 minutes and withdrew into the jungle, moving swiftly along pre-planned escape routes. Behind them, the remnants of the Japanese patrol remained trapped in the nets, waiting for rescue that would arrive too late for many of them. The official Japanese casualty report for December 18, 1944, recorded 26 dead and 34 wounded from the 74th Infantry Regiment Patrol, ambushed near the Pampanga River crossing. The actual numbers were likely higher. The Japanese routinely underreported casualties to maintain morale. The guerrilla casualties were 0. Not a single one of Teng's 11 fighters had been hit, despite the Japanese return fire. The combination of darkness, elevated positions, and the enemy's complete disorganization had made the guerrillas effectively invisible. The material captured included 37 rifles, over 2,000 rounds of ammunition, 6 grenades, 4 officer swords, and a complete set of patrol maps showing Japanese garrison positions and movement schedules throughout central Luzon. The intelligence value alone was worth more than the casualties inflicted. But the strategic impact went beyond numbers. The Japanese response to the ambush revealed how thoroughly Teng's technique had disrupted their operational assumptions. For the next 3 weeks, Japanese patrols in the region were reduced in frequency and increased in size. Platoon strength forces were replaced by company strength forces, sometimes with armor support. Routes that had been used regularly were abandoned. The patrol schedule became irregular and unpredictable. All of this was defensive adaptation. The Japanese were reacting to the guerrillas, not dictating the terms of engagement. For an occupying force, that was a strategic defeat, regardless of tactical outcomes. More significantly, the Japanese command couldn't explain what had happened. The patrol survivors reported being trapped by wire obstacles and ambushed by a large force. They estimated the guerrilla force at 40 to 50 fighters based on the volume of fire. They couldn't explain why they hadn't detected the obstacles before hitting them. They couldn't explain why their standard counter-ambush tactics had failed. The incident report, translated after the war from captured Japanese documents, included this assessment from the regimental intelligence officer. Enemy guerrilla forces demonstrate unexpected sophistication in obstacle construction and ambush tactics. Recommend increased reconnaissance and obstacle clearance procedures for all patrol routes. What the report didn't say, what the Japanese officers couldn't conceptually process, was that they'd been defeated by fishing nets. The cognitive dissonance was too great. So they defaulted to the explanation that made sense within their framework: sophisticated obstacles, large guerrilla force, tactical failure by the patrol commander. The truth was simpler and more humiliating. They'd been defeated by an improvised trap designed by a fisherman who understood rope better than they understood doctrine. When Tang and his team returned to the guerrilla camp on the morning of December 18th, Captain Reyes was waiting with the rest of the command staff. The radio man had already reported the success of the ambush. Captured, Japanese radio traffic had confirmed massive casualties and route abandonment. Reyes looked at Tang for a long moment, then held out his hand. Tang shook it. "I owe you an apology, Sergeant," Reyes said. "I was wrong." "Your technique worked." "The technique worked," Tang corrected. "Whether it keeps working depends on adaptation. The Japanese will start looking for nets now. We'll need to vary the approach." That was the beginning of what became known in guerrilla circles as Manalastas nets, a family of related trap and ambush techniques that evolved over the next 8 months of the Philippine campaign. The basic principle remained constant: use unconventional obstacles to immobilize superior forces, then exploit the immobilization with concentrated fire from concealed positions. But the implementation varied wildly. Sometimes the nets were replaced with wire cables. Sometimes they were combined with explosive charges that detonated when soldiers tried to cut themselves free. Sometimes they were positioned in water crossings, where the additional resistance of the current made escape nearly impossible. Sometimes they were purely psychological, fake nets positioned where Japanese scouts would find them, causing patrols to slow down and bunch up, creating opportunities for conventional ambushes. The Japanese never developed an effective counter tactic. Oh, they tried. They assigned point men with long poles to probe ahead for obstacles. They used dogs to detect ambush positions. They even experimented with flamethrowers to burn suspicious vegetation before advancing through it. But all of these countermeasures had a fatal flaw. They slowed the patrols down, and slow patrols were vulnerable patrols. The Japanese found themselves in a strategic catch-22. If they moved quickly and maintained operational tempo, they risked net traps. If they moved slowly and carefully, they gave guerrilla intelligence networks time to track them and set up ambushes at choke points. Either way, the guerrillas controlled the engagement terms. By the time American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf in January 1945, beginning the campaign to liberate Luzon, the Japanese garrison structure in central Luzon had effectively collapsed. Not because of any single major battle, but because of cumulative attrition from dozens of small-scale ambushes and raids, many of them employing variations of Teng's net technique. The American liaison officers who began working with the guerrilla forces in early 1945 were were initially skeptical when they heard about the nets. One officer, a West Point graduate named Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, wrote in his after-action report, "The guerrillas described a tactical technique involving fishing nets that seemed implausible until we examined the physical evidence at ambush sites. The innovation demonstrated by these irregular forces, with minimal formal training, suggests that conventional military education may be insufficient for counterinsurgency operations." That was as close as a West Point graduate was going to get to saying the fisherman was right and we were wrong. What Teng had discovered through practical experiment was something that military theorists would later codify as asymmetric warfare doctrine. When you lack the resources to fight conventionally, you change the nature of the fight itself. You create situations where your enemy's strengths become irrelevant and their doctrine becomes a liability. The Japanese were trained to respond to gunfire with aggression. The nets turned aggression into suicide. The Japanese were trained to maintain formation integrity. The nets turned formations into mass casualties. The Japanese were trained to value morale and fighting spirit over tactical flexibility. The nets made morale irrelevant. You can't fight harder when you're physically immobilized. But the deeper insight was about observation and adaptation. Teng hadn't invented anything new. Fishing nets had existed for thousands of years. Barbed wire had been used in warfare since the 1880s. The innovation wasn't in the materials. It was in seeing the connection between civilian experience and military application that professional soldiers had missed because they'd been trained to think about warfare in specific categorical terms. A net was for catching fish, not soldiers, except when it wasn't. This kind of conceptual flexibility became the hallmark of effective guerrilla operations throughout the Pacific. The Philippine resistance forces, operating with minimal external support until late 1944, developed a reputation for improvisation that confounded Japanese intelligence assessments. They built mortars from iron pipe. They manufactured explosives from fertilizer and diesel fuel. They created anti-vehicle mines from artillery shells that failed to detonate during American bombardments in 1942. And they used fishing nets to destroy infantry patrols. After the war, when military historians began studying guerrilla operations in the Philippines, Teng's technique was included in several case studies on unconventional warfare. The U.S. Army Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg added a section on improvised obstacles to their training curriculum, specifically citing the Pampanga River ambush as an example of effective resource utilization. But the formal recognition came with an ironic twist. The military analysts who studied Teng's technique tried to systematize it to create a doctrine that could be taught and replicated. They produced manuals with diagrams showing optimal net placement angles, mathematical formulas for calculating entanglement, probability based on enemy formation density, standardized protocols for combining net obstacles with fire support. They'd completely missed the point. The technique worked not because of any specific configuration, but because Teng understood principles, how materials behaved under stress, how humans responded to unexpected physical restraint, how to observe enemy patterns and exploit predictability. Those principles couldn't be reduced to a formula. They had to be discovered through attention and experimentation. You couldn't train someone to think like Teng by teaching them where to place nets. You could only train them to observe carefully, think creatively, and test ruthlessly. Those are skills that require experience, not instruction. The story of the fishing net ambush spread through the guerrilla network within days. It spread through the Japanese garrison forces even faster. By late December 1944, Japanese soldiers were seeing nets everywhere, in shadows, in hanging vines, in morning mist. The psychological effect was almost as valuable as the tactical effect. One captured Japanese patrol report from January 1945 included this observation: enemy forces are using sophisticated trap systems that cannot be detected by visual inspection. Recommend all patrols halt and conduct thorough reconnaissance every 50 meters. The recommendation was impractical, and the officers knew it. Following that protocol would reduce patrol coverage to the point of operational paralysis. But not following it meant accepting the risk of walking into traps. The Japanese were learning what every occupying force eventually learns. Controlling territory is expensive. Controlling hostile territory is very expensive. And controlling hostile territory where the local population has learned how to fight back is sometimes impossible, regardless of force ratios. The Teng continued operating with guerrilla forces through the liberation of Luzon in 1945. His technique evolved continuously. He started training other guerrilla units in net construction and deployment. Some of his students improved on his methods. One guerrilla leader named Carlos de Mayuga developed a variation using hemp rope soaked in oil and set on fire after the enemy became entangled. A brutal but effective modification that turned the nets from an immobilization tool into a direct killing mechanism. Teng himself preferred the original approach. The nets didn't need to kill directly. They just needed to create opportunity for the guerrillas to kill efficiently. That distinction mattered to him, though he couldn't always articulate why. Perhaps it was the difference between being a soldier and being a sadist. Perhaps it was just professional pride, a fisherman's appreciation for tools that did their job without unnecessary elaboration. By the time Manila fell to American forces, in March 1945, Teng had participated in 17 separate ambush operations using net-based traps. 14 had been successful by the guerrilla definition of success, inflicting casualties significantly disproportionate to resources expended. 2 had been tactical failures when Japanese patrols detected the nets before hitting them and avoided the kill zones. 1 had been a disaster when a net anchor failed and the trap collapsed, forcing the guerrillas to withdraw under fire. That 17-operation track record gave Teng a better success rate than most formally trained officers commanding conventional forces. It also gave him something more valuable: credibility. When Teng proposed a tactical approach, people listened. Not because of his rank, he never rose above sergeant, but because he'd proven that unconventional thinking produced conventional results. War leaves marks. Not all of them are visible. Teng lost his hearing in his left ear during the liberation of Angeles in April 1945. A Japanese grenade exploded close enough to rupture his eardrum. He lost 2 fingers on his right hand to a bayonet during the same engagement. He lost friends. Paulo, the young guerrilla who'd questioned him before the first net ambush, was killed by a sniper in February. Captain Reyes died when a booby trap exploded at a Japanese supply cache in March. These were the costs of resistance. Teng accepted them without complaint, because complaint would have been meaningless. The occupation had to be fought. The fighting produced casualties. That was the arithmetic of war. What Teng didn't lose was his sense of proportion. He never became the kind of soldier who believed his own mythology. When younger guerrillas started calling him the Trap Master or the Net Weaver, he told them to stop being ridiculous. He was a fisherman who'd learned to adapt his skills to a different environment. That wasn't mystical or legendary. It was just practical application of existing knowledge. This refusal to embrace heroic narratives probably saved his sanity. Many guerrilla fighters who'd survived the war found themselves psychologically unable to return to civilian life. The intensity of combat, the constant danger, the moral simplification of occupation versus resistance. These things created a framework that was hard to abandon when the framework was no longer necessary. Teng transitioned back to fishing in late 1945 as if he'd never stopped. He returned to Malabon, rebuilt his father's damaged boat, and went back to work. The nets he built now were for catching fish, not soldiers. The principles were the same. The applications were different. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked about his missing fingers or his damaged ear, he gave factual answers without elaboration. Yes, combat injury. Yes, it hurt. No, he didn't want to discuss the details. The American military awarded him the Bronze Star in 1946 for exceptionally meritorious service in connection with ground operations against the enemy. The citation specifically mentioned innovative tactical techniques that resulted in significant enemy casualties and contributed to the liberation of Luzon. Teng accepted the medal politely and put it in a drawer. It wasn't that he was ungrateful. He just didn't see what he'd done as particularly meritorious. He'd solved problems using the knowledge he had. That's what people did during wartime. The ones who survived were the ones who solved problems effectively. The ones who didn't survive were the ones whose solutions didn't work or who didn't have time to try. Luck mattered as much as skill. Teng knew that. The medals didn't account for luck. In 1958, a Filipino military historian named Colonel Thomas Valdez conducted a comprehensive study of guerrilla operations during the Japanese occupation. The study included extensive interviews with surviving guerrilla fighters and analysis of both American and captured Japanese military documents. Valdez's section on improvised warfare techniques devoted 8 pages to Teng's nets. The analysis was thorough and professionally skeptical. Valdez had served in the Philippine Army and understood both conventional military doctrine and the reality of guerrilla operations. He wasn't inclined to romanticize improvisation or dismiss professional training. His conclusion was careful. Sergeant Manalastas's technique succeeded not because it was inherently superior to conventional tactics, but because it exploited a specific gap in enemy doctrine while leveraging available resources and terrain. The technique required unusual preconditions: enemy forces following predictable patterns, terrain suitable for concealment and obstacle placement, accurate intelligence on enemy movements, and operators capable of adapting civilian knowledge to military applications. When these preconditions existed, the technique was devastatingly effective. When they did not exist, conventional harassment and ambush tactics proved more reliable. It was a perfectly reasonable academic assessment. It was also, in Teng's opinion, when he was interviewed by Valdez, completely missing the point. "You're trying to turn it into a system," Teng told Valdez during the interview. "That's not what it was. It was observation. I watched how the Japanese moved. I understood how nets worked. I connected the two things. That's not a system. That's just paying attention." Valdez pressed him. "But surely there are principles that could be taught, ways to help other soldiers think more creatively, about resource utilization. You can't teach creativity, Teng said. You can teach observation. You can teach people to question assumptions. You can teach them to experiment. But you can't teach them to see connections that aren't obvious. Either they notice things or they don't. This frustrated Valdez, who was trying to extract transferable knowledge from guerrilla experiences. But Teng's point was valid. The most effective innovations in warfare, from the longbow to blitzkrieg to stealth technology, came from individuals who saw possibilities that existing doctrine couldn't accommodate. You could study those innovations after the fact and incorporate them into training. But the next innovation would come from someone else, noticing something else that everyone else had missed. That was the nature of tactical evolution. It wasn't systematic. It was opportunistic. Teng lived until 1987, dying of heart failure at the age of 80. He'd spent the last 42 years of his life as a commercial fisherman, raising 3 children, participating in local politics, occasionally attending veterans' gatherings where old guerrillas told old stories. His obituary in the Manila Bulletin mentioned his Bronze Star and his service with the guerrilla forces. It described him as a humble man who served his country with distinction during the darkest days of the occupation. It didn't mention the nets. That detail survived in oral tradition. The veterans who'd fought with him told the story to younger generations. The story got simplified in the retelling. Fisherman uses fishing nets to defeat Japanese patrol becomes legend. The complexities were lost. The barbed wire modifications, the precise positioning calculations, the coordination with rifle fire, the multiple failures before the successful techniques emerged. All of that faded from the narrative. What remained was the core image. Underestimated man uses unconventional technique, proves the experts wrong, saves lives, wins battles. It's a compelling narrative. It's also reasonably accurate, as far as simplified narratives go. In 1918, 2 years before his death, Teng gave his last formal interview about the war. The interviewer was a graduate student from the University of the Philippines, writing a thesis on guerrilla innovation during the occupation. The student asked the inevitable question: do you think your technique could work in modern warfare? Would nets be effective against contemporary military forces? Teng thought about it for a while before answering. The specific technique? Probably not. Modern soldiers have night vision, thermal imaging, communication systems that would detect and avoid that kind of trap. But the principle? The principle is permanent. Military organizations train for predictability because predictability creates coordination. But predictability also creates vulnerability. Anyone who can see the patterns and disrupt them effectively has an advantage, regardless of force ratios or technology levels. That was true in 1944. It'll be true in 2044. The student asked if he had any advice for future military planners. Hire more fishermen, Teng said, smiling, and fewer generals. The story of Vicente Manalastas and his fishing net traps has entered the catalog of guerrilla warfare legends alongside stories of partisan fighters in Yugoslavia, resistance operations in France, and irregular forces in Vietnam. It's studied in military academies as an example of asymmetric tactics. It's referenced in special operations training as a reminder that formal education isn't the only path to tactical effectiveness. But the real lesson isn't about nets or tactics or even guerrilla warfare specifically. The real lesson is about the intersection of knowledge and necessity. Teng had knowledge that seemed irrelevant to warfare: how to construct and deploy fishing nets. The war created a necessity: stopping better armed, better trained enemy forces with minimal resources. The intersection of that knowledge and that necessity produced an innovation that nobody with conventional military training would have considered. This pattern repeats throughout history. The most significant military innovations often come from outside the military establishment. Civilians bring perspectives that professional soldiers can't access because professional soldiers are trained to think within established frameworks. The challenge for military organizations is creating space for those outside perspectives without compromising operational discipline and effectiveness. It's a difficult balance. Too much openness to unconventional thinking produces chaos. Too much adherence to doctrine produces brittleness. The Philippine guerrilla forces in World War II found that balance, partly by necessity. They had no choice but to accept unconventional ideas because they lacked the resources for conventional operations. But they also found it through leadership that was willing to test ideas rather than dismiss them based on professional assumptions. Captain Reyes deserves as much credit as Teng for the success of the fishing net technique. Reyes could have rejected Teng's proposal outright. He had the authority and the professional justification. Instead, he authorized a limited test, accepted the results when they contradicted his expectations, and incorporated the technique into broader operational planning. That's the mark of good leadership in any context: the willingness to be wrong, the humility to learn from unlikely sources, the judgment to distinguish between ideas worth wielding and ideas worth dismissing. Teng provided the innovation. Reyes provided the institutional space for the innovation to be tested and validated. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. On the morning of December 18th, 1944, 73 Japanese soldiers walked into a jungle clearing expecting a routine patrol. 26 of them died there, tangled in fishing nets they never saw coming, killed by guerrillas they never located, defeated by a technique that no military manual had ever described. The man who designed that technique never attended military academy, never read Clausewitz or Sun Tzu, never commanded anything larger than a fishing boat before the war forced him to command fighting men. But he understood rope. He understood tension and weight and leverage. He understood how living things respond to unexpected constraint. And he understood that the line between civilian knowledge and military application exists only in the minds of people who've never been desperate enough to question it. The Japanese occupation forces learned this lesson at extraordinary cost. They'd conquered the Philippines with superior firepower, training, and doctrine. They lost control of it to farmers and fishermen who fought with whatever worked rather than whatever was supposed to work. Vicente Teng Manalastas died peacefully in his sleep, 42 years after the war ended. He was buried without military honors, at his request. His family scattered his ashes over the Pampanga River, where the water flows past the jungle clearing where fishing nets once caught soldiers instead of fish. No one ever doubted him again. But more importantly, no one who fought with him ever forgot the fundamental lesson he embodied. That expertise is knowing what's possible. But wisdom is knowing that possible is always larger than anyone has yet imagined. His technique was simple. His legacy endures.